Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. One of my favorite images from traditional security studies is the idea of author Hersman, who worked for the RAND Corporation, sitting on the beach in sunny Santa Monica, writing his book on thermonuclear war, contemplating the end of the world. The fundamental insight of Kahn's book is that things don't immediately go nuclear in the sense of uncontrolled escalation. An example he uses early in the book, for example, is that if Chicago were to be hit by a nuclear weapon, but no other city, that we might think that striking Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, would be a suitable retaliation. Following this logic through, Kahn came up with a famous 44-step escalation ladder. Our guest today suggests that this ladder has been rendered obsolete or at best uncertain by a convergence of technological, systemic, and social changes that change the very nature of escalation. We're really privileged to be talking to Rebecca Hersman, author of Wormhole Escalation in the New Nuclear Age, which you can find in Volume 3, Issue 3 of Texas National Security Review. Rebecca, if I could ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Rebecca Hersman, and I'm the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues at CSIS.
Excellent. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this article and to work with this really evocative image?
Well, it's kind of funny. I was in an event. It was a book launch event probably a little over a year ago. And it was on new concepts of strategic stability. And I was trying to explain, different ways that Russia or China or the United States might think about the echelons of conflict and their desire to compete therein. That the United States would prefer to compete in that, sort of conventional military echelon where we're comfortable, where we're strong, where we're dominant, right? And so logically, our primary competitors would want to be, not in that space, right? So they're either going to move up or potentially move down. Conversation moved on and people started talking about the escalation ladder and kind of how you might step through and how to manage strategic stability. And it just kind of came out of my mouth. Don't think ladder, think wormhole. And we kind of had a little laugh. And another senior person who was on the panel was like, I love that analogy. The whole ride home in the taxi from the event, I just started scribbling. I walked into the office after the event. I had already had my pen and my notebook, and it just was like pouring out. And I was like, I'm going to have to write about this. And if it's a silly analogy, so be it, but it speaks to me. And that's how it was born.
No, I think it's a really evocative and really terrific one to convey the lack of certainty about what might be a trigger event and where that trigger event might take you. And so I think it works really, really well. One of the things that you introduce as a concept early in the article is the concept of a domain that you call subconventional. And there's a phrase you use that I absolutely love when you talk about people going below and beyond. And so what is the subconventional domain and how do you one up or one down someone in that domain?
Subconventional, we can kind of pick our favorite word, right? A lot of people are going to be talking about gray zone. Sometimes you talk about hybrid. There's a lot of words that get at that. I just went with subconventional because, again, I was trying to just be clear. We're talking about below the conventional echelon of conflict and a space that includes a lot of dimensions that might be seemingly military in nature, but might be more information space, could be more in the economic space, but certainly could be quite coercive. But that, I guess I'm an imagery person. If you think of kind of like going below the surface, right? It's murkier. It's kind of harder to see. It's harder to visualize what's happening down there. And so that's the space. When you think below and beyond, so below is definitely getting below that space. You're being highly coercive. And what's interesting in this is that we've always gone below. Like there's always been a desire to go below conventional conflict to achieve outcomes. The question is, do the types of technologies and capabilities that we have today and the strategic intent of the countries involved mean that they can actually go below, but still be very strategic, attack strategic level interests. And at that point, perhaps render that conventional echelon sort of obsolete, irrelevant. That's a wormhole, right? That's how you collapse that time-space continuum, that all of a sudden you're in a strategic conflict and you didn't have the braking effect that in some ways conventional stepping through those echelons would do. So that's that. All right, beyond. What do we mean about that? Well, it's not just that you go below. It's that you go below and move to a wider set of tools that are in different domains that are less familiar, especially in terms of strategic stability thinkers and practitioners and planners. So we don't understand a lot about the relationship between economic coercion and stability, right? We don't understand a lot about how those things would affect if you actually managed to kind of really influence in a way where you could threaten a state and its kind of structure, its basic viability. But beyond is more than that. Beyond is also the seam between different echelons. And seams are always tricky, right? We always know weaknesses lie on the seams, whether they're at, in other parts of the article, I talk about the upper seams, right, between conventional and more strategic. But seams are complicated. Seams always present certain weaknesses. And so if you could visualize, right, along these echelons, going beyond means kind of pushing along the seam in these different areas. And so those are the two dimensions, I think, that it's relevant.
One of the things I really appreciated in your discussion of subconventional, in a way in which I think your discussion is distinguished from a lot of the discussion about gray zone or hybrid, is specifically taking a look at the social effects of manipulation of information. And this struck me as a really, really smart and important point that so often gets left out, is that politicians respond to pressures from their societies, even in an authoritarian regime. And just talk a little bit more about the risks that we face and why they're different now.
Well, social media in particular, but again, I think you're right to put it more broadly than just social media, but that is, how do you kind of tap into that emotional sector in society in a way that can create pressure on political leadership? It's so fast and it's so proximate. You're really kind of able to tap into that and to do it incredibly quickly. And even traditional tools, more authoritarian regimes can sort of try to control it, but they're not really able to do it very well. I talk in the article about some of the challenges of that and how it became intersectional with politics and security in the case of the India-Pakistan crisis in 2019, right, where it kind of played out in both ways. The whole social media escalation, the verbal kind of rhetorical escalation that occurred, was also very tied to an election cycle, where it was very important for the leaders to appear strong, to kind of reflect certain things back to their constituents, and therefore seemed to be influencing how that media was affecting them in their decision-making about the crisis. Today, we don't have to look too far in terms of COVID response, right? We've seen this, the heartbreaking kind of politicization of COVID response really reflects this, I think, in a lot of ways. The, interjection of conspiracy theories, the, kind of way that people are turning to social media for advice and information, the pressure it's putting back on politicians as they manage constituents but try to manage a crisis. But even the way that type of incident and the way that it's playing out shows us you can get to some pretty strategic interests in a crisis without firing a conventional shot.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I really find fascinating about your argument, is it ties together conventional crisis stability and what we think of as nuclear crisis stability. And, this sort of image in people's heads of what is a nuclear crisis. And you can go through, there's a couple of famous articles that code them and look for dyads of nuclear countries. And there's this really sort of traditional crisis analysis school within international relations. And I think one of the really important implications of your article and your argument is that we can't draw such a clear distinction anymore, and that this type of subconventional conflict really changes the dynamics of crisis stability, even in one that we may think of as conventional. Is that right?
Yeah. First of all, I think that's always been a completely false divide. And my background is a little different from some of the folks who work in the space. And I'm the first to say, look, I'm not really an academic. my background is much more as a practitioner, but I've always, I think, maybe I've been a secretly curious academic. That's why I wanted to write a pretty wonky article.
We all have our secret shame to admit somewhere there.
Yeah. For me, I think I'm secretly there, really liking that kind of wonky theoretical stuff. But my background's more as a practitioner and not as a nuclear sort of theoretician. I come from the counter WMD world, and it's a bit more operational. And there have been many more crises that have actually occurred, right? Where you kind of have had to do crisis management in the real world. And that it very much affects my thinking. It's because it's present, it's here, you actually do it. That couldn't be more important now. In the past, you thought, okay, if it's the United States and the Soviet Union, we're never going to fight a direct force-on-force war, right? Because that would lead to nuclear escalation. And therefore, we're just not going to even get that party started. Okay. North Korea or other regional parties, it's different. I hope we don't fight some sort of conventional war, but it's not impossible. And we will have to manage escalation across these scenes. You can't kind of have a, this war will never happen, this party will never get started approach. You have to be thinking about how will I actually manage that? And in those types of scenarios, I think that divide is utterly false. And among other things, you're likely to have a crisis. We've had provocation cycles before. You never really know, right, when the big one's coming. So you have to always assume it's part of what you're doing. The other really important thing about that is I feel like in a lot of times in the nuclear community, when we talk about nuclear crises that might escalate, we drop ourselves into the movie in the middle. We just kind of parachute in and, the action sequence is already going and everyone's fired up and it's just like, let's just, prevent nuclear war. Okay. But a lot happened, right, before that. And in fact, that's what I wanted to talk about in the article, is that maybe the most important things that could affect strategic stability and escalation happened much earlier, much, below and beyond, right, what we think of as that stability. And that makes me think differently about crises, whether it's a potential invasion in the Baltics or something happens in Belarus or there's a, extended deterrent crisis, because I'm thinking what happened at the beginning of the movie.
And, so much of nuclear crisis literature and even conventional crisis literature talks about the quote unquote risk of miscalculation. And I think one of the really important takeaways from your article is that the miscalculation isn't necessarily just in terms of what the likely response to move X by opponent Y may be, but about what the nature of the crisis is to begin with and how that works. That kind of harkens back to that wonderful quote from Clausewitz about the most important task of the statesman is to know the type of war in which they're engaged. And it, as you point out, that's not so easy anymore. When I took a look at sort of the effects of the phenomenon you describe on nuclear crisis stability, to me, it seemed like there were sort of three bins that you could put those effects in. And one we've been discussing a little bit is this conceptual bin between what is a nuclear crisis or a conventional crisis and where those lines or fire breaks are. Another is a social bin, the sort of the effects of how these technologies may accelerate social effects and pressures on decision makers, as well as forcing them to make decisions with not only imperfect, but often manipulated information. And then the third is sort of a systemic bin, and this is maybe in some ways the most frightening, is the ability of these technologies to attack the systems that we use for nuclear command and control. And so I guess my first question is that taxonomy reasonable? And then the other is if we could talk a little bit about how those different effects manifest.
Well, yeah, I think it's reasonable. In fact, I'm sort of listening to it going, gee, I wish I'd used that. That would have been good. And the rewrite, I'll think about that. But yeah, the systemic one is interesting. And, I think it's important. This is a very exploratory article, right? Like I'm putting these ideas out. I'm not saying all these things are going to happen. I'm not saying these are physical weaknesses. I'm saying these are potential intellectual, right, gaps in our thinking. So when you think about command and control, it's that, right? I'm not suggesting that there's a widget and that if you buy it, right, you're going to fix this problem. But what I am saying when it comes to nuclear command and control systems, presidential level and government level crisis management, decision-making processes, that as we are working rightly so hard right now to upgrade and improve our national command and control systems, we might want to think not just about hardening, right, the system, when you don't understand what's happening around it. So that if hardening makes it less and less transparent, for example, to people, that, to the public, that may actually weaken it in some ways. It might reduce its political resilience. And that's important because of these sort of social dynamics and pressures that can occur. So the way I've talked about that in the article and another piece we've put out on nuclear command and control and in things we do inside my program, the project on nuclear issues, is kind of saying, all right, when it comes to protecting command and control, you have to think of both the back door, classic cyber, how do you break in, but think about the front door. If the system gets undermined, if it's not perceived as legitimate, if the processes are not trusted by the public, does that really help you very much? And under a longer crisis, that becomes important. The old crises where you say, oh, it's going to be 15 minutes, they've launched, here we go, everything's going to be super secret, super fast. I hope we never have that, but it's not the most likely scenario. The more likely scenario, right, is that we're in a sustained crisis. Things are moving. Maybe you've started down below in this below and beyond space, and things are going on a while. So that means that closed system, right, is going to take a lot of hits from the outside. It's got to be able to sustain that. And that's the concern I'm trying to raise in that context.
Yeah, when you think back to some of the closest encounters of the Cold War, it wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was things where often we never knew that there was such an encounter until long afterwards, things like the Able Archer exercise or the other incident, and I can't recall the gentleman's name, but it was a Soviet controller who saw a mistaken indication of a launch on his system and decided, no, that wasn't credible. But exactly the risk you point out is the ability to undermine that credibility. And that's pretty frightening. One of the other things that strikes me in this notion of front door versus back door, and also the question of the fire breaks between conventional and nuclear crises, is that this is also made more complex. And you allude to this a bit in your article, looking at some of the work of Caitlin Talmadge, and I think Tom Christensen's worked on this as well, is that there are some powers, particularly relatively new nuclear powers or powers with smaller inventories, that co-locate their command and control. So at one time, there's this kind of notion of, okay, well, it's taboo. We aren't going to mess with their nuclear systems because that would send a bad signal. We won't do that, but we'll mess with everything else. It's not so easy to do that. And that's made even more complex because there's more players in the game now, aren't there?
There's more players in the game, and the nature even of the conventional warfight has shifted. So, for example, for us, as well as most of our competitors, major competitors, command and control is pretty integrated at this point, right? Between what you do on the conventional side and what you do on the nuclear side. Things are traveling in the same pipes. They're reliant on the same satellites. So it's very difficult to disaggregate. On top of that, you have a situation where most of the resources that we would use to gain situational awareness, whether it's advanced drone capability or other resources or cyber surveillance or a whole host of things, those tools are also, again, they're at the seam. They are kind of working along that space. They could inform nuclear aspects of a crisis. They're vital for conventional aspects of a crisis. And because they're vital for conventional aspects of a crisis, an adversary likely wants to target them even in a conventional crisis. So this begs the question of whether fire breaking, again, fire breaking is very ladder oriented, right? Ladder thinking produces fire breaks. I think for the most part, fire breaks are going away. You're not going to be able to get those back. You're not going to be able to kind of disentangle things that are entangled. That's not where technology is going. So what are the alternatives to fire breaks? Well, I think in some places, what I think the United States is doing is looking at, really accentuating redundancy, right? You go the opposite direction. You just build so much redundancy in, you expect things are going to be targeted, and you kind of demystify some of that, perhaps. So that's just one possible way to think about it. But it is really important to realize that there's no rolling back some of that integration, especially at the at the sort of strategic information level. So we're going to have to figure out how to manage that without introducing, incredibly high risk strategic challenges every time someone, kind of passes a message on the conventional battlefield.
And talking about fire breaks in these seams, one of the other areas that tends to, I think, stress these concepts is the question of low yield nukes. And I think many of us have heard of a Russian strategy of escalate to de-escalate, the idea that they could use a nuke with a low enough yield that it wouldn't be significantly worse than a conventional weapon, but at the same time demonstrates a willingness to cross a threshold. And again, that's great if I have a ladder. But if I have unpredictable results, that's pretty frightening. I mean, you go back to the history of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. They were designed expressly to start the escalation ladder and to signal a willingness to do that. That was the whole idea of the Pentomic Division, right? Is, we're going to get out there and force you to say anything you're going to do is going to go nuclear. So that'd be bad. Let's not do that. Let's just, fight other places in proxy wars. How does wormhole escalation affect this whole concept of low yield nukes and nuclear crisis stability as we're looking at it?
Well, so it's interesting because it was partly me wrapping my head around the thinking about this, escalation management, low yield nuclear weapons, and why I was so kind of uncomfortable with the strategic logic of both sides of that debate. Okay. So, it's kind of important to keep in mind, I actually don't think necessarily that the addition of these lower yield capabilities are inherently destabilizing, or, I don't kind of ascribe to the sky is falling reaction to them, because I don't think they're necessarily lowering the nuclear threshold. But my bigger problem with them is that I don't understand how we're talking about escalation management when the conversation, we just talked about this at the beginning of the session, when the conversation is starting halfway through the movie. In other words, that conversation starts in the scenarios that they're discussing when another country uses a low yield nuclear weapon. And the worry is that the United States will only have, won't have steps, sufficiently appropriate, calibrated steps to hopefully manage escalation up the ladder, right? That's the whole mindset. It is a ladder mindset. Okay. Well, what if that maybe you didn't get to that first nuke, no matter who uses it, right, on a ladder? What happened to get that conflict started? How did that crisis start? What if you got there through the wormhole, right? I don't think Russia's starting a conflict with us with a nuke in the Baltics. If there's a conflict that starts between the United States and Russia, or NATO and Russia, it is starting below and beyond. That's where it starts. If it gets to a conventional war fight, it's probably done it by accident, and it's probably because some opportunism went wrong. And if it gets to a nuclear shot, it's because somebody ended up with their back against the wall and they don't have another way to end the conflict intact. What does that really look like? So if you take away the lateral analogy, then the utility of that and its importance from an escalation management perspective, in my mind, goes down. So it's not really this disaster of a destabilizing capability, but I think it inspires incredibly false confidence in terms of its ability to introduce stability at that point in a crisis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it also, I think, helps to answer one of the more challenging questions that's raised by your article, because one of the aspects of a wormhole is that it's somewhat indeterminate. If you go in one end, you're not sure where you're coming out. And of course, for the concept of escalation, that's really problematic, right? And that's precisely what you point out, is that the models we've been using to think about it will not give us an accurate prediction. But that doesn't mean that it's entirely indeterminate. And I loved that phrase you just used about an adversary feeling like they had their back against the wall. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how we might think about this sort of holistic effects from the beginning of what the adversary perceives to be the beginning of the crisis, and how those contribute to understanding when we've pushed as far as we can push.
It's funny because I'm actually not like a science fiction nerd. I mean, it was fun. And I went back and tried to just sort of investigate a couple of wormholes, and you can really go down some interesting rabbit holes about, time-space travel and, how do you stabilize a wormhole? The one thing you kind of get out of some of that literature, and I can only take so much of it, was that wormholes are inherently unstable. They might open for a period of time, and then the problem is, they'll open or close, you might not know. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So if you think there's this gap that appears in the fabric of deterrence, it may stay for a while, it may go back together. But, when they were thinking about this time travel thing, it's like, well, is there a way to stabilize it? And I think that's kind of how we have to think about it. You won't get rid of these wormholes. You could move, but are there ways to stabilize? Are there ways to recognize when it's happening? Are there ways to kind of make it work to your favor? I put out a Twitter thread and I got some really interesting comments. And one of the comments I really appreciated was, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure you're right, because a lot of the things you describe that might be subconventional or influence-oriented or cyber in particular, there's some research to suggest they don't just escalate, they could actually de-escalate. They could provide off-ramps. And I was like, oh, you're totally right. That's a great point. I don't disagree, in fact, because wormholes go both directions. So, I think that's the way to think about it is, okay, how do we go the other way? The wormhole's still there. That's, I think, what we need. And in fact, it could be a really interesting way. If you think about a crisis, if a crisis opens up on you, you have to think okay, I'm not going to think louder. I'm going to think something else, but how do I back out through this? I think that's what we would try to do. And if your mindset is going there, you might be able to think about, all right, how do I use these informational kind of tools? How do I use cyber to do that? How do I use my situational awareness, my information gathering, my ISR in different ways that support me going back the other way in the wormhole rather than up in terms of an escalation to nuclear war? Same tools, maybe communicated differently, maybe done more or less transparently, maybe, all kinds of things you could do that maybe would help you turn this, risk into an off-ramp.
That's somewhat hopeful. That's good to hear, because that is also, your article in many ways is terrifying, right? This idea that if we are not properly conceptualizing escalation, the likelihood of finding ourselves in unintended escalation is, of course, much higher. But in addition to the notion that wormholes go both ways, you offer another ray of hope, which is a discussion of arms control. But it's arms control conceived somewhat differently than I think most of us think about it. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, so I'm squarely in the camp that treats arms control not as necessarily a path to disarmament, but as a tool in helping us manage stability, to manage really dangerous arms racing, to help us manage crises, and put tools in place, right, that might help us, either stabilize the wormhole or back the other direction. So when you look at it that way, it should be a tool for that. Arms control, the more competitive the environment, there should be some areas where, states involved have a stake in trying to negotiate some boundaries. None of these countries actually want to fight this big war, right? They just want to achieve as many of their strategic objectives as possible at the lowest cost possible. That's what they want to do. So when cost imposition becomes really, really high, they're going to try to find a way out of that. And arms control offers some of those tools. The trick is we have to be able to recognize the type of information environment that we're in and the dynamics that have changed so that we can do arms control successfully in what will be a very complex environment going forward.
Yeah, and that was something that particularly struck me, was how much you focused on the importance of recognized standards and protocols in internet and cyber and information. And I mean, it almost seems like these are, if not as important, perhaps more important than the limitations of the weapons or transparency in the procedures. But of course, a challenge with this is that when you start talking about these things, particularly in democratic societies, you run up against concerns about freedom of expression and about privacy. And I'm wondering how you interact. I mean, just because it was too simple before, how do you interact all these things as you start bringing them together?
When I think about, wormhole escalation and arms control, on the one hand, I think it actually makes arms control more important, because you're going to need these tools to help sort of stabilize that space, create more common understandings in and across countries to understand escalation, understand how to manage it. If you're not going to have a series of steps to sort of watch and warn you as you go, right? That actually puts a premium on improving your crisis coordination, reducing some of your arms racing. So on the one hand, it's more important. But it also, the same things that are introducing those escalatory risks are also attacking the institutions and structures of arms control. That's the important part that we have to work on. So that same information environment that makes crisis management extremely difficult, that information ecosystem, the power of influence operations, the presence of cyber, disinformation, conspiratorial thinking, all of that can be directed at the institutions of structures of arms control. And they have been. Even, like as I said, with chemical weapons and others, they have been directed at that. Look at what's been happening in terms of the WHO and COVID as well, right? So all of that can be directed there, and undermining it institutionally and weakening the informational basis on which it depends. Arms control is really all about information. You're not actually fighting. You're trading information. If you're engaging in sort of crisis stabilizing things, you're saying, here, I'm going to share information. I'm going to have a hotline. Why do you have a hotline? I'm going to trade information, right? In hopes of doing so reassures you that I'm not attacking you, just as an example. It isn't, it's all about the information. So how do you make sure it's reliable? How do you make sure it's trustworthy? How much of it should be private and secure between leaders? How much of it needs to be publicly accessible? How do we decide who are appropriate public, social media, and the other arbiters of facts? And when it comes to verification, what are the tools of verification? What are the standards of verification? And who and what institutions are the arbiters of verification? In other words, whose information do we trust? So when we look at verification is one simple core thing, right? Verification is about the identification of a fact and then returning time and again to measure whether that fact has changed, whether it's the presence of a warhead or the fact that a silo is empty or the fact that a missile's been cut. You can name anything. But verification basically says, you've told me something is true, I've established that truth, so we all believe it, and now I'm looking for whether or not it ever changes. So how do we do that when in this kind of information environment? We're going to have to figure out how to work better with open source. We're going to have to work with non-governmental entities that'll be big players in here. And we're going to have to figure out how to arbitrate and to professionalize that space so we understand who to trust and who not to trust. Because the misinformers, the disinformers, and the reliable informers are all circulating in the same space right now. And that's the challenge.
That's an enormous challenge. And especially, you mentioned in the article the challenge posed by deep fakes and things like that, which only make that all the more challenging. You open your article in a way that I think is clever and entertaining. You take one of the paradigmatic cases of nuclear crisis and you talk really briefly about how that might look differently today. And I'm going to ask you to expand on that a little bit and to think about some of the things that we just talked about not parachuting in the middle and about how these things affect. What would the Cuban Missile Crisis look like if we were experiencing the escalation dynamics that you posit in your article? Or would we have a Cuban Missile Crisis? Would it have been something else entirely?
That's a good question. I don't know. The first thought that comes to mind when you bring that up is, wow, 13 days sounds like an eternity. Right? What a long period of time for decision makers to have some semblance of private, secure thinking, managing, without just sort of everything playing openly in the public. It's really hard to imagine ever recreating that. That's kind of the first thought. So part of this kind of, step compression, if you want to think of wormholes as kind of being something that sort of compresses the steps between things, is the fact that the information environment and the ability for decision makers to have that secure space to do that it seems really unlikely. It seems difficult to imagine you could kind of, insulate them from all of those other factors. It seems hard to imagine you could fully insulate from politics. I'd like to think maybe we could sometime in the future, but I'm not sure that's really possible. So how would it play out differently? I guess the real question is, would it present some other opportunities? What's interesting is probably if something like that were to happen today, national technical means wouldn't be the only people tracking things moving around. You have Google Earth, you have all these open source, you'd probably have it being, we could all watch it on our computers. You would have people sitting out on their boats or on their decks or anything else that's observable and holding up their cell phones and tracking the information and uploading it on social media. And there's parts of that would be absolutely horrible and terrifying, but there actually might be over time certain benefits to that. In the same way that you kind of, the bad guy doesn't get freedom of kind of full freedom of action, freedom of motion either. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, is we have just to be careful that we don't assume all aspects of this are bad. If we channel it, we might be able to make it work on our behalf.
You mentioning Bellingcat a little bit ago and then talking about social media, it reminds me very much of the process they did of reconstructing the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner, where they relied on social media posts from soldiers who were in the missile batteries. And so, it's an entirely new means of verification that may in some ways be more believable because it's not intended to be observed. And so then you have a different way to get a hold of and get at these issues in some ways. Although then once you know that it's there, then you can work to spoof it.
It's true. They have a lot of, they can do a lot of things. What's difficult is figuring out how do you go forward and say, okay, they're legitimate. And someone else who's, constructed, I've done a lot. I've done a whole case study on the chemical weapons attack in Douma, Syria, where there have been about 5 or 6 different reconstructions that are largely designed to support the ideological view of the person putting it forward. Now, personally, I trust Bellingcat's version. It fits with my understanding of the facts. But we've got to find a way to make sure we can appropriately discredit the poor information and give credit to the compliance assessments, because that's basically a compliance assessment of another organization that might be more accurate, more reliable. But we also have some really big issues in terms of professionalizing. It's a very competitive space, and we've got to do a lot of work to professionalize it, and also to make sure it operates within certain ethical codes, because you can put people in a lot of risk. Countries can trace back. Let's say, for example, things are uploaded, videos, and this goes to the MH17. Where do you obtain those videos? Who is in danger? Who put something up off their cell phone and now they can be tracked by another country? So there's a lot of implications in terms sort of ethical problems as we learn to operate in this space outside of government control.
So your article, I really enjoy this. I think it is provocative. It is thoughtful. It stands on its head a lot of our sort of casual understanding of how things work, and it challenges a lot of preconceptions. What's next in this research agenda for you?
There's a few areas we're hoping to work on. We have a project underway in the arms control space where we hope to bring a lot of these issues to bear and to really talk through some of the, how can arms control be a better tool in this environment, and how can we understand and better manage the tools of the information ecosystem to support rather than undermine arms control. So I have a project I'm working on there that I'm pretty excited about because I feel like I want to contribute to making this better, not just describing how bad it is. I'm hoping to do some other work looking at actual scenarios of, okay, what might an escalation scenario look like and how might you kind of simulate or exercise that? Trying to map out these scenarios and look at different ways, because that's kind of how I have a defense background. That's how kind of defense planners and defense strategists think. We're very sort of gaming, exercising oriented. So I think trying to support that would be really useful. I think we have to map out what this looks like and then figure out how to kind of play against it, simulate it and then react. And that's a good way to exercise our thinking. And then I'm going to try to figure out which additional threads to kind of pull a little harder. I'll be honest, I've never really worked. I've done projects that were longer, like big kind of research projects. I have never spent a whole year writing and rewriting one article. So for one thing, I'll say I'm really glad you liked it because I worked really hard on it. But I'm looking forward to applying it. So I think at the end of the day, that's kind of my heart is actually in the application, the practice. And so I'm hoping we can explore what it means, in the real world.
Excellent. We've been talking with Rebecca Hersman of CSIS. Her article, Wormhole Escalation in the New Nuclear Age, appears in Volume 3, Issue 3 of TNSR. It's online at tnsr.org, and I really encourage you to go and read it. It will change some of the ways you think about what you thought you knew about nuclear escalation and nuclear crisis. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.